Hey y'all, welcome back to Rogue Trotting. Today we are really excited to kick off a cool video series that we have all about sex and sexuality in both America and Denmark. Of course, we're going to be comparing the two countries and the differences in how they both approach topics of sex and sexuality.
Yeah, and today's video is the first one. It's going to be a little bit of a general overview on sex and sexuality. We're going to touch on some topics that we can compare the two countries about. So things like nudity, how people talk about sex with family and friends, and the perception of sex in the media.
Yeah, so to help us with those three topics and some other general discussion on sex and sexuality in the two countries, we decided to consult some experts. One is American and one is Danish, and they've both studied sex, sexuality, and relationships in both countries. They're going to be excellent sources for us to learn more about the topic and share it with you. So let's get into it.
Hi, my name is Jenna Strizzi. I'm a PhD in Psychology of Sexuality from the University of Almeria in Spain. And I'm also a Master of Sexology from the same university. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I've been dedicated to the scientific study of sexuality since 2006. I moved to Denmark in 2017 for a postdoc in anxiety and sexuality. I'm originally come from the United States.
I am Camilla Øvrup, and I am originally a Dane, but moved to the US and lived there for 13 years. During that time, I received my PhD in social psychology from the University of Houston with a focus on intimate relationships. I am a postdoc here at Copenhagen University and study sexuality and romantic relationships.
So one topic that I think is going to be good to start with is going to be nudity in the US and Denmark. And it's something that when you're a foreigner coming to Denmark, you notice the first time you go into a gym or a swimming hall.
Yeah, or even a nice summer day.
Yes.
My experience growing up was I felt uncomfortable being nude, even in locker rooms, changing in phys ed class and things like that. And I wanted to know why I had that experience growing up and what it would have been like if I grew up in Denmark. Would I have had that same feeling?
Okay, so we know that Danes and Americans really differ on their attitudes and comfortability with different topics of sex and sexuality. So maybe I'll throw out a few categories and we can discuss kind of where both cultures and both types of people feel about each one. So the first one, nudity. What about nudity between America and Denmark?
Nudity is pretty much not okay in the United States.
Right.
There are some places where it is legal to be nude in public, but that's not many places in the United States. And while there are multiple cultures within the United States, generally it's not well seen. It's not okay to be nude in public, and especially regarding children. There's a lot of taboo about nudity and children, whereas in Denmark, that's quite different.
It's sort of the opposite, particularly in warmer weather times like the summer. You will see a lot of people wearing very little clothes, and it may be mortifying to Americans to see such bare bodies, but nudity is much more accepted in Denmark.
Yeah. And I think you'll see a lot of Americans may expect, oh, it's Europe, there may be nude beaches or topless beaches and things like that, but it also really goes even farther, I think.
Yeah, in parks and many public spaces where, but one caveat that's really important is that nudity is not sexual. Mm-hmm. Public nudity in Denmark is not an invitation for sex and is not seen as sexual. That the body is natural, and tanning and enjoying the beautiful weather when it happens in Denmark is just natural. And we need to make sure that that's quite distinct, because people coming from more restrictive cultures can see it with different eyes.
Yeah, the Americans often equate nudity with sex, and that's not the case. I think the Danish attitude is more, it's a body, it's natural, it's just who you are.
The attitudes towards nudity in public are changing in Denmark over time. That it was more common and people were more open to it, and younger generations are being perhaps influenced by outside cultures of that not being as common. Wow. To go topless or to be nude in public there's more of there's a taboos creeping in.
That's interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe it comes from the media, or sort of from American media and movies and things like that.
And public discourse also maybe coming from the U.S. About clothing and coverage of body parts. That could be. I mean, again, growing up in Denmark, it was seeing a topless man or a woman with less clothing on was more common than I feel like it is today. That's a very good, and that's only anecdotally, but.
Wow, really cool conversation. Really eye-opening too, and understanding a bit more about the two cultures and kind of where they're coming from with that. And it was interesting to hear about how media even has some impact on that.
Yeah, and that American media maybe is creeping in here and changing the more open Danish mindset over time. Not sure about that.
Yeah. Well, the next topic that I wanted to ask was kind of about talking about sex and kind of the awkwardness, speaking of media, that you even see in movies like American Pie, for example, or some of those old classic movies where it's depicted as a really awkward situation. And if that was the experience that Danes have as well, or if that's something that's kind of uniquely American.
Yeah, and I'm curious if the classic sex talk between parents and kids is any different in Denmark versus the US, so I'm excited to hear what they have to say.
Roll it.
What about the topic of sex and discussing sex? Maybe whether you're with friends or girl talk, guy talk, with family, in front of parents, things like that. What about just talking openly about sex and sexuality?
Well, of course, there's, again, lots of subcultures and different cultures within the United States, but it's not a polite topic. It's not something that you have to have a very close relationship with someone to discuss sexuality openly. And with parents, within families, it's not, it's the joke in sitcoms.
Yes.
It's the joke in every romantic comedy, or in comedies when parents have to talk about sex with their children.
Yes.
Because and that's telling, because it makes people uncomfortable. It's funny because it's uncomfortable.
It's portrayed as awkward, and in reality, it can be.
Well, there's in general a lot more open discourse about sex, whether in the public space or in the more private space between friends. But I also think that there might be more similarities than we think. So while Denmark is in general more open about sex and having conversations about sex, Sexes, a large study of sexuality in Denmark, revealed that most people haven't had sexual conversations with their parents. So there may not be a whole lot of parental talk about sex similar to the US, but that there's still a perception that it's okay to talk about sex, whether in private with friends or family, or in the public space.
That statistic was from Project Sexist. It was 82% of men and 70% of women said that they, during their adolescence and childhood, that they rarely or never talked about sexuality with their parents in Denmark. So if there were discussions, they weren't very frequent. So we should be careful not to think that it's a conversation over the dinner table all the time.
Right.
While it may be the Danes may be more open about sexuality, it's not. There's a limit to it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
Kind of surprising that the sex talk is just as awkward in Denmark as it seemed to be in the US. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, well, I guess some things defy culture and are the same anywhere. I guess talking with your parents about sex is just kind of weird. But it was refreshing to know that it isn't such that it's not talked about in Denmark. It's just not necessarily with mom and dad.
No, a little more in social circles. And I wonder if in this next segment, a little bit of that as well, which is how sex is depicted in the media. I mean, we know here in Denmark about the classic things like the John Dillermand series. There's the series on DR where you had kids looking at naked adults and being able to ask questions about them, things that would never happen in the US and actually got ridiculed in US media. Yeah. So I'm curious what kind of you were going to talk to them about and how nudity and sex is depicted in media.
Yeah, so we know that there's probably a general more openness, but let's go and hear what they said.
Now, what about kind of sex in the media or sex censorship and things like that, and even pornography? How is that portrayed in each society?
Much more open in Denmark.
I've noticed that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nudity and sexual scenes are quite common, have been quite common in movies and media. for decades.
Yeah.
I remember growing up here, and it was not infrequent that you might see nudity or sex on TV. Quite the opposite in the U.S. still, to this day.
Mm-hmm. And Denmark was pioneering in terms of pornography. Pornography in terms of literature was legalized in 1967. It was the first country to do that. And then visual and audiovisual pornography were legalized in 1969.
Wow.
So they were one of the top legal producers of pornography in the 1960s and 70s, late 60s and 70s.
Now, it's interesting, obviously, that Denmark has been more open and have less hang-ups on those portrayals on screen or audiovisual. It's interesting then with now American media and movies, whether it's on Netflix or things like that, you know, it may almost feel like if you grew up with more Danish media and had those things and then are watching more global media, especially coming out of Hollywood or the US, that you're almost taking a step back in what you see.
Yes, that was honestly my experience when I moved to the US, was that I came from Denmark, where you would see nipples and body parts, but all of a sudden it was sort of devoid from the media space. And whenever there was anything, it was made almost like it was very bad. You can't see that. It's a scandal, like taboo. And it was very odd to sort of take that step back.
It is funny to see sex portrayed in American movies because they have the sex scenes, but people are in lingerie. You can show a male nipple, but not a female nipple. And it's like, it's also maybe not a good portrayal because it's not super accurate, at least in my experience.
No, everything is definitely made to look pretty on screen.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting that some of the anecdotal experiences that we've had in both countries are kind of validated by the research that they've gone through. I think it's also interesting, probably my biggest takeaway on this is, number one, again, the fact that the sex talk is difficult in both, but I think the other one is maybe that creeping American Puritanism, or maybe it's just all the cultures that have coming into Denmark that maybe are making it where that kind of open kind of nudity and sex on TV and kind of free kind of concept is maybe getting closed down a little bit, whether it's influence from the outside or just kind of a general, maybe a little bit of a prudishness coming in. Not sure. It was really interesting to hear that.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes to something that with social media especially, kind of if you're basically having American social media companies dictating the terms of service, then you're basically going to be bound to what they allow. And if you're not allowed, you know, we talk about it in another video about The Little Mermaid, but at one point The Little Mermaid was reported for nudity on Facebook. And it's kind of funny that I think it was a Danish politician was posed with The Little Mermaid.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny that something as innocent as that would have been flagged on Facebook, but they have a certain algorithm, they have technology to identify nudity, and it's against their terms of service. So that influence, you see it, and it's fascinating how it's changing not only American society but also Danish society vis-a-vis social media.
Yeah, whether it's that media or public media, it makes sense. If you're going to have a bunch of American sitcoms that make sex the punchline and the awkward joke, it's going to creep into the culture. I think that's a really interesting takeaway on this here.
Yeah, so as social media and Netflix and other media make the world smaller, it's kind of melding the cultures, and some may be lost there.
So this is really good. You're a great interviewer, Derek.
Thank
I can't wait to see the rest of this, as should you. So this is only part one. 2 more parts coming on this one, so be sure to look for them when they come along as well.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure that you're subscribed and hit the bell for notifications so you can see the next 2 parts of the series as soon as they're published. Thanks a lot, guys.
Hi.